Maybe it's just me, but I hadn't actually deeped that Fidel Castro, prior to him becoming a guerrilla fighter, was a lawyer, meaning that he understood the system from the inside. He knew law, and he had attempted to fight imperialism with pen and paper. So in 1952, Fulgencio Batista came into power. He seized power via a coup, and Castro had attempted to fight against that legally, meaning that he had filed a constitutional complaint, but that pretty much fell on deaf ears. The courts pretty much dismissed it, ignored it. There was no real rule of law. Basically, he was ignored. Now let's park that thought for a moment. Like, Castro wasn't a man who was born into poverty. Like, his family were financially well off. His father was a Spanish immigrant who had built a sugar plantation in Cuba. Castro went to private school. He had graduated as a lawyer from the University of Havana. Like, he was a man who was born into privilege. He had that ability to be able to look the other way, build on his family's wealth, climb up the ladder, protect the interests of corrupt companies, and become even more financially well off than his family. Like, he had that privilege. And for whatever reason, he decided to go down the route of guerrilla warfare and persevere against imperialism. And it kind of makes you wonder what drives men like him and Guevara to go down that path. Because like I said, the guy had options. He wasn't exactly driven by the immigrant dream, the I need to get my family out of struggle kind of a scenario. Like, he didn't come from the poorest classes that he was fighting for. And we're all very familiar with that meme. I'm going to insert it, the one that goes, corruption's only bad if I'm not in it. If I'm in it.
Corruption is not bad. Corruption is only bad if I'm not involved.
Yes.
But if I'm part of that corruption, I'll defend it.
And so it makes you wonder, men like Castro, Guevara, alongside all the other men that they were fighting alongside for those 2 years in the mountains and the jungles, what drives them to persevere in those conditions? Simply because they believe that imperialism is wrong, they're trying to overthrow a dictator, and equality for the masses. Like, the average person is driven by personal interests, their loved ones. That's what's going to help them to push through in those kind of dire situations. Whereas for men like Guevara and Castro, what gets them to move away from comfort and persevere in that uncertainty? Anyway, let's rewind the clock. So remember how I said Batista comes into power, seizes power in 1952. In 1953, Castro attacks the Moncada. Well, there's the Moncada attacks where they attack a military base. Batista understandably doesn't like that, so Castro is arrested, he's put on trial, and he's imprisoned. Now, Batista wants to improve his public image. He doesn't want to look like that he's running an authoritarian regime and that he's running a democratic process. And so Castro is released. Castro has a following, a group of people who sympathize with the cause of ending imperialism, ending foreign dominance, reducing inequality, and the anti-dictator movement. But Castro understandably does not feel safe in his home country in Cuba. So he takes a flight to Mexico where he regroups with other Cuban exiles. Now, they all have their varying different ideas and thoughts, but where they all align on is that Batista needs to go. Anyway, they make their way, they sail their way back to Cuba, 82 men, the Grand Expedition. They land in a poorly planned location, swampy, they're exhausted, they're exposed. Within a couple of days, Batista's forces ambush them. From 82 men, they're now down to about 20 men who then regroup, hide in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Now, the men have no formal military experience amongst them. You've got Che Guevara, who's a doctor, Raul Castro, who's a student/political activist, Fidel Castro, who's a lawyer, Camilo Cienfuegos, who's a mechanic/tailor, Juan Almeida Bosque, who is a construction worker, Uber Matos, who's a head teacher. By the way, I don't speak Spanish, so I might have butchered these names. Anyway, they have no formal military experience. So on paper, it looks statistically impossible. They're up against the Cuban military, who are backed by the US, The US, of course, are very much interested in keeping control over their economic influence over the sugar, the tourism, their businesses. It doesn't look quite good on paper. Of course, you could argue that they had the support of the local villagers, the small farmers, the workers who would provide them with food, as well as with intel in terms of the whereabouts of their opponents' movements, and give them that bit of intel. And of course, the guerrilla fighters were using the Sierra Maestra Mountains as their hideout because, again, they don't have that conventional warfare knowledge that the military has. And so the mountains was a good place to hide out. But again, when you look at the roles, the jobs that they had left behind, there's something about that they did not need to take on these roles. They could have just continued with their day jobs / shenanigans. Statistically, what they achieved was like Mission Impossible, because you've got to factor in hunger. Food wasn't always guaranteed, especially in those early days. Diseases, because they're in warm tropical environment, think malaria. Some of them have underlying health conditions, like Guevara, who's like the doctor of the group. He's got chronic childhood asthma. Now, I don't know if they had inhalers in the 50s, but I can't imagine the humid, him exerting himself would have been good for his asthma. What else is there? The fact that they've got damp clothing, the wet boots, you can imagine fungal infection, the contaminated water, the outbreaks of diarrheal illness, and of course the exhaustion. And remember how right at the start they've gone down from 82 men who came on board, who sailed their way to Cuba, and from those 82 men right at the start they were down to about 20 men. So you can imagine that must have been a hit on morale. And they're persevering in these circumstances for about 2 years. So on paper it looked like Mission Impossible, but they still did it. All of this to say, it kind of makes you think, like I said, men like Guevara and Castro, they're from privileged backgrounds, financially well-off families. It makes you wonder what pushes men like them to persevere despite the hunger, the diseases, the uncertainty, for this period of time, for the 2+ years that they had been in these diabolical, dire circumstances, all for the purpose of pushing for freedom and minimizing the inequality amongst the masses in a way that doesn't actually benefit them. Like I said, they're from privileged backgrounds, so there's no direct benefit for them. But yeah, these are my thoughts. Let me know what you guys think. And as always, I'm interested to see what your thoughts are.